I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar to be delivered by Dr. Alex Wood on how power and despotism works in flexible workplaces. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Monash University campuses stand. We recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community, and we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar is centred on Dr. Wood's new book, and we will have Greg Bamber involved in introducing Dr. Wood, and then we will also have Fang Lee Cook speaking at the end as a discussant. Today's webinar is sponsored by ICREW, the International Consortium for Research on Employment and Work. ICREW is part of the Monash Business School's Centre for Global Business, and affiliates are currently engaged in a number of projects in private, non-for-profit and government sectors with a view to improving organisational performance, stakeholder wellbeing and public policy measures. I see that amongst our participants in this webinar is Professor Chong-Woo Cho, who is the present Director of the Global Business Centre. Having said that, I would like to now hand over to the Director of ICREW, Professor Greg Bamber.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. Marjorie is the Deputy Director of ICREW and an accomplished researcher in the field of industrial and employment relations and labour history. And it's my pleasure to add to her welcome to you to this webinar, which is in honour of the late Professor William Brown, known to everyone as Willie. Willie died last year, much too young at the age of 74. Willie was a great inspiration and mentor and friend to many of us, including me. I first lucky enough to meet him when I was still an undergraduate student, and have kept in touch with him as a great friend and colleague over the intervening years. And he was also an advisor to Alex Wood when Alex was doing his PhD at Cambridge. So I'd like to just express sympathy and condolences to all of Willie's many friends and his family, and we all miss him very much. And Alex is going to talk about a very topical subject today: managerial despotism after COVID-19. And Alex will no doubt share with us that he started his research and indeed conducted his research before the pandemic hit us, but his research and his findings have great relevance for us as we contemplate workplaces in the future. He's speaking to us from Bristol in England, where it's quite early in the morning, and he's affiliated with the University of Oxford and also the University of Birmingham. So if there is a silver lining to this pandemic, perhaps the silver lining, as Chong-Woo reminded us recently, is that it becomes more feasible to have webinars like this, inviting people from around the world to share their interesting insights with us, even if they're not able to physically be with us in present. But having said that, Alex, I remember one of Willie's favourite expressions. He said, well, I'm not going to rabbit on any further, and nor am I. I'm going to hand over to you, Alex, but just we'll remind people present in the webinar, and there are people present from various countries around the world, including the UK and the Asian region and Europe, as well as Australia. Just to remind you, if you have any comments or questions, please share them using the chat function, and then we can have some discussion after you've finished your talk, Alex, which I think you're going to give for about 30 minutes, which will leave plenty of time for discussion. So over to you, Alex, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to be with you this afternoon for you and this morning for me. I've never actually been to Australia, so this is the closest I have come to Australia, but I hope to come closer to you all in a physical sense. At one point, let me just share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see my screen now. And hopefully that. Ooh. Okay. So it was great to start with a little some thoughts on Willie. And so this was my PhD research, and Willie was really a mentor to me throughout my PhD. And so many of the chapters that make up this book that this talk is then going to be based upon, I discussed with Willie, and he gave me a huge amount of encouragement. I should probably say, to be fair to Willie, he probably wasn't a fan of all of it. He wasn't a fan of the theory, but what he really was most excited about and why he took me under his wing was the kind of empirical side of it, which really discusses the nightmare that many workers who the coronavirus has really shown are so essential to our societies and to our economies, the kind of suffering they face due to the way in which work is increasingly organized. And so this is something that I'll touch on in a lot of the talk. But I wanted to start off by just kind of going over what the general aim and approach that I'm going to take is. And then I'm going to introduce the two case studies which the research is based upon. Both have pseudonyms. One is Conflict Co., which is one of the biggest retailers in the world, the US retailer, which I studied in California, and Partnership Co., which is one of the biggest retailers in the world as well, but is a UK retailer, and which I studied in London. Then I want to kind of go on to really look in depth into this misery and this scheduling nightmare that people faced at both of these retailers, and try and really get across this kind of suffering that people face as a result of working in a flexible workplace. And then my main argument then is around how this precarious scheduling, this working time nightmare, enables a new form of control within the workplace through what I call flexible discipline, and then schedule gifts. So the kind of general approach and aim that I take is one which I build upon the work of Michael Borowoy. And kind of central to this approach is seeing paid work as a power relationship, which is then embedded within networks and within institutions in both the workplace, but also within the wider labour market, and indeed in society more broadly. Borowoy also provides one particularly key insight, and that is that exploitation is not only secured through coercion, through discipline, and these forms of control, but it also has to necessarily be obscured from the eyes of those people who are being exploited. Because if people didn't misrecognize their exploitation, then they would rationally resist that exploitation. And so exploitation in capitalism is both secured through coercion, but also obscured at the same time. Now, because this is a power relationship which is embedded within these institutions and these networks, we start to be able to see historical tendencies in whether firms are relying more heavily on the use of coercion in order to achieve control, or legitimization in the firm. And so this is something which Borroway argues is how he identifies these two workplace regimes. He argues there's market despotic regimes, and here's an example of a market despotic regime, and he's really building on the work of Marx and how Marx describes the factories of the 19th century. And so Marx talks about how there's, in these cotton mills, in these early factories, there is barrack-like discipline, which is dividing workers into manual laborers and overseers. In the factory code, the capitalist formulates his autocratic power over his workers like a private legislator. The code is merely the capitalist caricature of the social regulation of the labor process. The overseer's book of penalties replaced the slave driver's lash. Was the philosopher Fourier wrong when he called factories mitigated jails, he asks. Likewise, kind of Engels, in his famed study of the Manchester mills, talks about how the factory is where ends all freedom in law and in fact. The worker must eat, drink and sleep at command. The despotic bell calls him from his bed. His breakfast, his dinner, the employer is absolute lawgiver. He makes regulations at will. At will changes and adds to his codex at pleasure. The courts say to the working man, since you've entered into this contract, you must be bound to live under the sword, both physically and mentally. And what we see in England, and what I document in the book, is how this form of market despotism originated in these cotton mills, but it started to spread to other parts of the economy, even where workers remained more skilled and the work was less automated, such as the pottery factories. And so across kind of industries in this period in England, you see control was being achieved through the corporal punishment of apprentices and children. You can see in this photo of this cotton mill how many children there were working in these places, in these workplaces, and it was considered legitimate to use violence to punish them, but also fines, threats of dismissal and blacklists against the adult workers. So as historian Sidney Pollard puts it, by comparison with these commonly used examples of the stick, more subtle and more finely grained deterrents were so rare as to be curious. And so then in 1789, Samuel Slater risks treason to bring Arkwright's water frame to the United States. And we see kind of the spread of market despotism in the United States as well. But over time, this market despotic regime started to be transformed into what Borroway calls kind of hegemonic regimes, which were based upon the legitimization of authority within the workplace through institutions that enabled the concrete coordination of interest between capital and labor. So institutions like employment contracts, trade unions, collective bargaining, internal labor markets, which put administrative rules on the actions of managers, and profit sharing. And this was a result of there being kind of depression and government action, which led to monopoly capitalism. So the emergence of modern giant corporations, which had much higher profit rates, which meant that they could then, there was possibilities to offer concessions to labor, but also there was the growing strength of the labor movement as you got kind of trade unions forming. But as Beverly Silver points out, particularly importantly, this move towards continuous flow production, so assembly lines, such as on the right here, that really meant that it made it much easier for workers to actually cause mass disruption by kind of small work groups going on strike. And this kind of move towards hegemonic regimes was then cemented in the Second World War, where, for obvious reasons, the UK and the US wanted to avoid kind of mass disruptions to production. And you get this focus then on the legitimization of authority in the workplace. And you had these hegemonic regimes then continued until the 1970s, where you started to get new information and communication technologies, so barcodes, electronic data interchanges, product identification, and shipment and delivery standards, and GPS, really bringing the regimes in the core capitalist countries, such as the UK and the US, into competition with less hegemonic regimes in the kind of periphery of the world market. So this then really raises the question, and this is the question I was really interested in my PhD then, was what kind of comes next? What regimes comes next? How is control achieved in these workplaces, in kind of low-end working class post-industrial workplaces, in these workplaces which we now recognize due to coronavirus are so essential to our economy, and how does that then shape working conditions? And so to answer this, I did an 18-month ethnography in London and California, and this included working as a shelf stacker myself in a North London supermarket for 2 months. I also did observation of dozens of stores and union meetings, and undertook 81 interviews with 68 informants. And so these two case studies where I did this ethnographic research, they were quite, on the surface, appeared quite radically different in their approach to employment relations, in their approach to how to organize the workplace. So Partnership Co. in the UK, workers had employment contracts which gave them rights and protections. There also existed a very developed disciplinary and grievance procedures whereby their workers could be represented by trade union representatives who were very well trained. There was also a partnership, collective agreement, and so these elements really restricted traditional despotism, which is kind of the threat of dismissal by managers, and it really kind of meant that workers really weren't that worried about being fired. They felt like they had quite a lot of employment security in this workplace. They also had very high trade union density for a UK retailer, and the trade union was kind of growing quite fast. And so as a union rep, Jeff explained to me, he said, Partnership Co. isn't the worst employer. To get the sack from Partnership Co. is very hard, and on the whole, they do follow procedures because we have 168,000 members and they are pretty good, but only because of the union influence. And so having these trade union reps who were well trained, they knew what the collective agreement was, they knew the disciplinary procedures, they really could provide a lot of protection to workers from any threats or kind of bullying by managers. At Conflict Co., which I studied in California, which was also one of the biggest retailers in the world, it was completely different. At Conflict Co., workers didn't even have an employment contract. They had what's called at-will employment in the United States. And so every company policy would end with this statement, which is on this slide, which is, this information does not create an express or implied contract of employment or any other contractual commitment. Conflict Co. may modify this information at its sole discretion without notice at any time consistent with applicable law. Employment with Conflict Co. is on an at-will basis, which means that either Conflict Co. or the associate, the worker, is free to terminate the employment relationship at any time for any reason or no reason consistent with applicable law. And so workers really didn't have any employment protections. They could legally be fired for any reason whatsoever. So I'm going to close this curtain. And they managers then, this provided managers with a huge amount of kind of traditional despotic power through the disciplinary process, which wasn't even recognized as being a formal disciplinary process. It was referred to as coachings. And so a worker would be given 3 coachings and then fired. And if they would, this was basically an informal process. Any manager could give a worker a coaching for any reason. Workers weren't allowed a representative at that disciplinary meeting. They weren't allowed to see the evidence against them. They definitely weren't allowed a trade union representative, and Conflict Co. was famously hostile to trade unions. They had even shut down entire stores where people had voted for a union. Likewise, there was no real grievance procedure. Rather than having a grievance procedure, they had what was called an open door. And so this was supposedly the idea that you could go to any manager with a problem and they had to listen to it. And if they didn't solve it, then you could take it to the next senior manager. However, workers talked about this as being an open door to the sidewalk, because obviously you have no trade union protection, you have no disciplinary process, and you have this at-will employment. If you go and complain to a manager, then they're very likely just to fire you, or they'll talk to their friend who you're complaining about and fire you. There was also considered to be a very high level of surveillance through CCTV cameras, which were then used as kind of evidence against workers, but workers themselves weren't allowed to see this evidence. And so, as one worker, Omar, told me, you can get a coaching, so be disciplined for anything, man, because it's so crazy. Yeah, there's been some cool people fired over some bullshit reasons, good people who've been fired. However, even at Conflict Co., at the time that I was studying it, there was this union-backed workers association which was running a campaign against Conflict Co., and it had actually been quite successful at getting a lot of media attention of the negative practices at Conflict Co., and also winning cases at the National Labour Relations Board against Conflict Co. And so this, even here, where formerly and previously managers had this potential to use very traditional forms of despotism, managers found themselves having to be careful that they didn't end up in the media for their actions, or with the company being taken to court. And this then tempered kind of this obvious traditional despotism. And this kind of raised the question then, at Partnership Co., control couldn't be secured through these traditional traditional kind of despotism, threats of dismissal, because of the trade union, because of their collective agreement and kind of rights that workers had in the workplace. At Conflict Co. as well, there was also a need at that time for an alternative to kind of traditional, obvious forms of traditional despotism, because that could end up with the company being taken to court, or kind of fuel these negative media stories about the company. So that kind of raises the question of how then is control being achieved in these flexible workplaces? And I think the thing that really astonished me the most, so at Partnership Co, workers would say, originally I was interested in job insecurity, and I'd ask people, are you worried about losing your job? And people would respond saying, no, I'm not worried about losing my job. It's very hard to lose your job at Partnership Co. But I'm worried about my hours. I'm worried about my hours being changed or reduced, or there'll be overtime cuts. And this got me thinking about, what does it actually mean to be in a flexible workplace today? Well, 15% of UK workers experience precarious scheduling, in that their hours change at short notice without kind of any input into that scheduling, and there's a lot of instability in their hours. It's even more American workers. About 18% of American workers also experience precarious scheduling. So flexibility is increasingly temporal rather than numerical. And so as you have more data available, you have more complex models, you can use these to model demand very closely. And then if you don't have any collective regulations, then it becomes very attractive to try and match your labor supply to that predicted demand in real time, essentially. And this is what often happened. You'd be working a shift, and at the end of the shift, you'd be asked, as you're putting your coat on, to stay at work. You'd be rung up in the morning and asked to come in that day. And this was kind of the key thing in both of the interview data, also from the participant observation, was this flexibility of working time, and how it was really employer driven. It wasn't worker driven at all. Workers had no control over that. And so at both Conflict Co and Partnership Co, this was the case. Despite these very different employment practices, the obviously different kind of industrial relations context between the two countries. And so what this real-time flexible scheduling really meant for workers at both workplaces was precarious working time. So a worker in the UK explained to me how you get up one day and you think, right, I'm not working today. And then you get a phone call. You've not got anyone to look after your kids or whatever. You might just be going shopping to do your weekly shop, get a phone call, and you've got to come into work, and they daren't say no. And especially women with children, then they've got to run around looking for someone to look after their kids. Likewise, in the US, a worker explains it as being, your schedule is such a yo-yo, you can't have a life. And so this caused a huge amount of insecurity and stress to workers who were having to decide whether they went into work and so they could provide food for their family, or whether they provided childcare for their family. And workers were constantly under this stress, having to try and make these decisions. It was impossible to plan their lives, to have a social life, to play baseball or football at the weekend. And it was causing huge stresses for people every day of their working life. But not only did this really damage workers in terms of work-life balance, they're not knowing what their income was going to be because they were paid hourly, but it also meant that it gave managers a huge amount of power to arbitrarily discipline workers without going through the formal procedures. And managers at Partnership Co, they didn't need to discipline workers by going through the kind of strict disciplinary process. They could just reduce somebody's hours or move their hours. So now they had to work 15 minutes later when they were meant to be picking up their children from school. And so it put this hugely increased the discretionary power of managers. So as a union official, Tony explained to me If I challenge managers, I might not get the overtime, or I might not get my Sundays, or the hours I'm doing at the moment are perfect, as I can finish at 2. I can go home and pick up the kids. If I make a fuss, I might have that taken away, or I'll have to change, or I'll have my hours changed. So if I keep my head down and do as I'm told, I'll keep those hours. A worker in the US explained how if they change your time every time that you go to work, and they change your day off, that means they own your life already, because they look at you, they let you work anytime they want, any day they want, and you can't even plan for your life. So you end up with this sense that you don't have any power, any control over your own life. It's completely controlled by your employer, by your managers. But this then I think this at both workplaces, this is how control was being secured. Workers knew if they displeased their manager, they would lose their hours or have their hours changed to a time that would not meet their family and social needs. But it raises the question of how is then it being this exploitation, how is it being obscured from workers' eyes at the same time? And this then also relied on flexible scheduling and what I called scheduling gifts, because workers had to continuously beg and plead with managers for more hours, which would meet their material needs, or for their hours to be changed to meet their family and social needs. And when managers then responded by giving them a few more hours or changing their schedule slightly so they could provide childcare, inevitably workers felt very indebted to these managers they experienced this as an act of kindness on the behalf of managers, and they had no way to repay this kindness, what they sensed to be this kindness. They had no way to repay this other than through hard work. And so this is a very similar situation to the gift exchange that Bourdieu discusses in Algeria. And so one worker explained to me, it's all just temporary fixes, but then the person feels so grateful that the manager has given them the hours. But then next week, you have to worry again. And so it's this constant process of being worried about your hours and then begging your manager for help and then feeling indebted to them. And so, as another worker explained, sure, I felt very grateful when a particular manager says to you, let's sit down, let's take a look at your schedule and see what we can do. Then I'm grateful to that guy or gal. And this is something that I really experienced doing the participant observation. I wanted to be an average worker because I wanted to see what it was like to how the average worker was being treated. But I ended up being a favourite of the managers. They knew I was doing a PhD at Cambridge, and they liked to talk to me about that, about what it was like to be at Cambridge and doing a PhD. Then I needed my schedule changed so that I'd be able to get back to see my family at Christmas, or to have New Year's Eve off work. And these were changing your hours in these periods were against the company policies. When I asked my manager about it, he said, "Don't worry, Alex, don't worry. I'll sort it out for you." And then I felt this huge relief and indebtedness to him. And when he came to see how much stock I'd put out on the shelves, I felt bad that I wasn't working hard enough, and I found myself feeling this moral pressure to repay him through hard work. And so what I think this adds up to, what both these very different case studies show, is the centrality of working time in achieving control in flexible workplaces. And Jennifer Chun talks about how the regime that's replaced hegemonic regimes is flexible despotism. And she's talking mainly about how you have the use of agency and temporary workers, and this creates a lot of insecurity and enables despotism But I think increasingly, as we have this more temporal flexibility, the control is, this flexible despotism is really a temporal flexible despotism, which makes use of flexible discipline and these schedule gifts to both simultaneously secure and obscure control within the workplace. And in the US, we see this very reactionary form of flexible despotism where workers have very few other protections or benefits, whereas in the UK, workers did definitely benefit from having a trade union and having a collective agreement, and it provided some protections and a more paternalistic kind of workplace regime, but nevertheless, they still face this scheduling nightmare, they still face this flexible discipline, and they still experience this obscuring, this misrecognition through scheduling gifts. So rather, I think you get a progressive form of flexible despotism in workplaces like this, but it's nevertheless still this flexible despotism whereby flexibility of working time is really enabling the securing and obscuring of exploitation. And so that's where I'll end the talk.
Thank you very much, Alex. There's an opportunity now for anyone to raise any questions using the Q&A function. And so one question that someone has put in is in relation to the COVID-19 situation that we're all experiencing. To what extent do you think things are going to be different, or your analysis would be different in the period post-COVID-19, which of course has raised the significance in some ways of working in the context that you were studying, so that workers in big retail outlets have been called essential workers. I happen to think that most workers are essential, but workers in food retailing and so on have been described almost in the next breath to the workers in hospitals and care homes and so on. So any reflections on the post-COVID-19 or even during this pandemic, Alex, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's two elements. I think the first is I'm not very hopeful that kind of this recognition that workers have got, these low-paid workers have received, will last kind of that long. I think probably working conditions will get worse as we have a recession and we have even more labour supply, and Conflict Co. in particular is well documented. Its recruitment strategy is really to recruit workers from areas of high unemployment, and this was kind of really key in both of both Partnership Co. and Conflict Co. was workers were very dependent, even if they were only working on a short hours contract, they were still really dependent on this income. They didn't have any savings. They didn't think they had alternative options open to them, and so they didn't have many options to exit that relationship, that employment situation. And so I think there's probably, we'll see kind of an increase in bad working conditions. I think the positive thing is, as you say, around this recognition where these low paid workers are now being talked about in the same way as kind of medical professionals. And that is really where there was this workers campaign in the US. It really focused on respect and how these workers felt like they were being disrespected in terms of being paid basically the minimum wage, but also in terms of this kind of managerial despotism they were facing. And I think that's kind of my real hope, is that now this will have further kind of made workers realize that this is not the injustice of their situation. And I think this flexible despotism is quite an unstable regime because it's not supported by these hegemonic institutions of the past anymore. So it is possible for it to break down.
Well, thanks, Alex. And really following that same theme, there's a question from Jacqueline, who asks, with the greater use of flexible practices in workplaces, particularly in hospitality, service providers and academia, universities, how do you see this transitioning in the future? And she goes on that COVID has an impact, but will this continue to morph across other industries, even local and national government, to become the new norm for work?
Yeah, I think when it comes to flexibility, I think I'd take kind of a power resource approach. And I think it's important to think about situations with flexibility where the worker or employee has control of that flexibility and where that is really driven by the employer. And these things often, the flexibility that's beneficial to a worker, it will often not overlap with flexibility that's beneficial for the employer. And so I think in higher end workplaces, and so academics, for example, who in normal time, or at least the ones who are in a strong position, will have quite a lot of bargaining power, individual bargaining power. Then in those sorts of situations, flexibility can be very positive. And I think that will be a positive of COVID, will be that it kind of makes it possible to see how people can work more flexibly, and people don't need to be going into their office every day. They can be trusted to do their work. Whereas in low-end workplaces, we already see in the UK, kind of even during when the lockdown here was much more serious, kind of workers being forced to go into call centres, being low-end workers being forced to go into these places. And if you don't have that bargaining power to resist workplaces, then I think flexibility resist kind of employers, then flexibility and the lack of kind of regulation of working time and work and the spatial relations of work ends up in precarity for workers.
Thanks, Alex. And Peter Prowse from Sheffield in England asks you, how long do workers stay in these jobs with so little flexibility? Were there alternatives in London or California, for example? And one challenge is in retail is that there may be more instability. And I guess by that, he's perhaps reflecting on the closures we're seeing in retailing now, as some of it's being replaced by online shopping. And thanks, Peter, for tuning in all the way from Sheffield.
Yeah, so I think that's great point around kind of the stability, and both Conflict Co and Partnership Co were facing pressures when I was doing the research. So the fieldwork was actually kind of 2012, 2013, so it was a while ago now. But they were facing pressures from the growth of Amazon, from online retailing, because both of their kind of competitive advantage was having huge hypermarkets, and particularly for Partnership Co, owning a lot of the land where it's possible to build these huge supermarkets. And so that's also part of why there's this pressure on kind of the common phrase of Partnership Co is like doing more with less. And that's kind of how workers felt, and how when you spoke to the managers, they felt they were being asked to do. And so I think there is this transformation towards online retailing going on, and that's definitely going to have been massively increased by COVID. But I think we see similar practices in warehouse work. I think this flexible despotism is just as prevalent there. And in terms of workers having how long they stay in the jobs, so at Partnership Co, well, the union I think thought they had to recruit about 30% of their members every year because of labour turnover. So turnover was very high, but then the question is for these workers, like what are their alternatives? What are they going into afterwards? And I think they're going into similar retail, low-end service sector work, call centre work, or kind of often dropping out of the labour market. And so this was at the kind of end of the Great Recession. But Rio, who was a worker I got the train with from Tottenham up to this workplace in kind of the outskirts of North London, he had been unemployed for a year before he got this job. He then had to have moved back into his mother's house, and this was the first job he'd had in a year. And he'd taken the job, being promised more hours than what was in our contracts. So our contracts were for 8 hours spread across 4 days, so 2 hours a day basically. And he told the manager, I can't do this job if you're only going to give me as many hours. And so he was constantly begging for hours, but he wasn't a favourite like me, and he didn't get any extra hours. And then he was fired on Christmas Eve. He got a letter saying that he wasn't going to be needed after the holidays.
So an anonymous participant says that your reflections are a reminder of this person working in retailing whilst a university student, as I guess you were. Keep your head down, no control, and pretty much suck it up. And this person observes that there's too much power on both sides, which results in an unhealthy work environment. What would you prescribe if you had a magic wand to get more balance in the workplace?
I mean, if I had a magic wand, then I think what's crucial is that I don't think that workers have enough power. I think this is the problem in the UK, and in terms of low wages and productivity, and also bad working conditions. And Duncan Garley has looked at kind of job quality across Europe, and where you have better job quality is where you have institutions which ensure that trade unions have power, and so particularly Sweden. So I would bring in laws which removed nearly all of the, I think, the laws which really impinge people's freedom, human rights around freedom of expression on trade union action, particularly secondary action, whereby workers in a stronger position can support those workers. Also in the UK, we don't have a right to general strikes, which in Europe has been one of the main ways that trade unions have remained relevant. And then I think also having co-determination laws through like work councils, or requiring collective bargaining at both the firm and the company level. So I'd implement quite a radical labour relations reform.
Okay. And a follow-up question to that from Stan Rosenthal, who until recently was a senior official with the union that represents academics in Australia. And he says, asks, what's your view of where the capacity to bargain comes from in such situations? Does it reflect a collective bargaining capacity, if you like? And I'm summarizing a longer question that he's asked there.
Yeah. So in the book, I spend quite a lot of time with this question of at Partnership Co, whether there is elements of hegemony. And hegemony isn't really meant in a negative sense. It's meant that what Gramsci said is that there's a compromise equilibrium, that workers have power and therefore managers have to compromise, or employers have to compromise, and you end up with this equilibrium. And unfortunately at Partnership Co, like the trade union did provide people with protections, it did improve people's lives, but only in those areas. Its role was basically policing the policies which were determined by the employer, and it was very ineffective at winning kind of concessions from capital, because workers, despite having quite high union density, they didn't have much structural kind of economic power. Whereas at Conflict Co, there was this worker association which had very low membership, but was engaging in direct action and kind of symbolically damaging the employer through kind of press campaigns. And they managed to win some concessions from the employer. And I think those sorts of, unions need to provide to kind of a wider analysis of what forms of power can replace the kind of structural economic power that they've lost. And I think in many cases, there's more kind of symbolic power, which you can achieve through direct action and media campaigns can be an effective replacement.
Thank you. There's a range of other questions, but in view of the time, we probably better make this the last one, Alex, from a good colleague at Monash University, Amrik Sohor, who asks, what's driving the need for flexibility in the retail workplace? He points out that the workers and the managers are the same people who become customers of retail stores. And he says he's trying to understand the relationship between the customers' expectations from our retail stores. And by that, I guess he means wanting them to be open long hours and to sell things cheap on the one hand, and how these expectations are to be fulfilled. And just adding a footnote to that, reminds me on one of his visits here, Willie Brown was talking about the potential of consumer boycotts against the background of unions having less power, perhaps in the UK context and in the Australian context than they used to do. And he was arguing that possibly this could be addressed by consumers who are concerned about ethical working conditions, for example, of the potential for consumers to boycott stores or products which are not necessarily applying ethical approaches to management.
Yeah, great questions. So in terms of what's kind of driving it, I think, there's two elements. There's the decline of collective regulation and norms around working time, particularly in the UK and the US. And so there's this decline of internal labour markets, decline of trade union influence over working time. Also, this transformation, as the questioner says, around customers' expectations, that we have a 24/7 economy now, and you should be able to go to the shops whenever. But there's also this growth, this technological pressure, this growth of data. And so often what retail firms will be doing is combining kind of weather information with traffic data from smartphones, with previous sales data from last year, previous sales data from the day before, current shop footfall through the shop. And so you have all this much richer data source in order to create your scheduling. And in the absence of regulation, then it becomes the obvious thing to do is then to start really scheduling your workers very flexibly to meet that demand and kind of a real time on demand scheduling. But I think, there has been this shifting in customer norms as well, but that's partly also driven by everybody else working in this flexible way, that people think, I want to be able to go to the shop whenever, because I'm also, my working hours are also messed up. And kind of Judy Wiseman makes this point around flexibility might sound great, but if you don't have any coordination with the other people in your life and life activities, then actually it's not that useful having that flexibility. And just some kind of workers and managers being the same, I'd say a problem, particularly in partnership co, maybe less so I think also in Conflict Co, was that the managers were mainly university educated, and that's why I was a favourite of theirs, despite my best efforts, and the workers aren't. And the managers have never been in a low-end retail job. They're on a salary. They're not kind of paid by the hour, and so they've never experienced this kind of precarious scheduling, this working time kind of nightmare that the workers are experiencing. Oh, and on consumer boycotts, yeah, and this is something. So Chris Wright and Willie Brown have this great article on kind of reputational damage, and I think eventually, I think that's probably more effective. Is that companies care about their reputation because it'll impact on customers and sales. But I think it's kind of, rather than trying to organize consumer boycotts, which can be quite hard and can hurt the workers themselves, I think kind of damaging the reputation of the employer as a first step is a more effective way to go. And that's what Conflict Co, they basically damage the reputation of the employer so that Democrat kind of local councillors didn't feel like they could give Conflict Co planning permission to build stores. And Conflict Co had avoided the metropolitan markets because that's where unions had been strong in the past. And so it needed to expand into these metropolitan markets, but it couldn't get planning permission. So it's not just consumers, it's also, I think, the state, how the state views these firms, and whether the state feels that they are a company they can be seen to be supportive of.
Well, thank you, Alex. And rather than me saying thank you to you, I'm going to hand over to my much more articulate and distinguished colleague, Professor Fang Lee Cook, to have the last word. And Fang is a specialist in HRM in Asia in particular. She's also Associate Dean at the Monash Business School, who shepherds our PhD students very busily and effectively doing that. And Fang also leads the Monash Business Digitization Research Network. And I'd like to thank also those who've asked questions. And I know there are several other questions and comments that have come in, and I'm sorry, we should keep more or less to time. We can go a few more minutes because we're a little bit late while people were logging on. And just to mention that you quoted from Willie and Chris Wright. Chris Wright is actually on part of this webinar, lurking out there, and something like over 150 people registered for it. So it's great to have been able to share your thoughts with us and your insights today, Alex. So over to you, Fang.
Hey, thanks, Greg, and thank you so much, Alex, for a wonderful presentation, very rich. It is very rare to see a ethnographic study that spanned 18 months in depth in 2 countries. It's really interesting. So during your presentation, I came up with several questions, but some of the questions have already been asked by our audience. So I will spare those questions, but just want to cover a couple of points, if I may. In the labor process debate, which is very much the theory or the approach, critical sociological approach that you have applied in your thesis. And that reminded me of my days in Manchester University, or Manchester, which is the kind of heartland of Industrial Revolution, birthplace, and also the center of labor process debate in the 1990s, very much and 80s as well. So I was thinking that technology has been a very core part of the labor process debate, and initially in the manufacturing sector, and in the 1970s and 80s, the kind of debate, and then later on in the 1990s, were more shifted to the call center kind of debate, kind of workplace as the context for the research and debate. Then in the current days, I think in the in the retail centers or retail companies and large supermarkets, companies are starting to use the data analytics. So this is a new dimension of the technology or digital technology to use those data analytics to analyze the patterns of consumer time and types of things they buy, the weight they will be buying in particular period of time, and then to address the starving level and starving working time based on that. And we have seen that happening in China by the Walmart supermarket in China. And in fact, that has created lots of strike and labor disputes because of the that kind of annualized hour in a sense. So I was wondering whether early on in your presentation, you talk about staff are not anxious about whether their job has no security, but they are worried about the working time, so the temporal flexibility. So any managers who can adjust their working time, so the workers would be so grateful about it. But I was wondering whether these companies can have, whether technology can be introduced to make it less like a favor, ad hoc favor from managers to grateful employees, or rather it can be, on the one hand, increasing the efficiency of the staffing level and the stocking level by using data analytics to match those needs, and on the other hand, to match employees' working time needs as well to accommodate their work-life balance, etc. And this is very much in line with the International Labour Organization's kind of advocacy on human-centered HR practices in the future. Sorry, it's a very long-winded question to put the background on. Thanks. And so that was kind of one of the questions that I wanted to ask. I don't know whether Greg thinks that we have time to have a quick answer to this.
Why not? If people have to go pick up kids or whatever, they can do. But if those who'd like to continue that discussion a little further, by all means, Alex, if you wish to respond to.
Yeah,
thanks.
Great comment and great question. I think in terms of technology, I think it's possible for technology to kind of benefit workers, but it comes down to bargaining power. And so if you have I think the problem isn't so much the technology, it's about the social relations of that technology, and the fact that the company is kind of deciding people's hours, or the manager is, and I don't think that's gonna change through a technological fix. But in the gig economy, so at SASE on Saturday, I was kind of relating this research in retail to the gig economy, and what we see in some gig economy platforms, which are also part of the on-demand economy, is that what schedules, which hours you can select depend on your metrics around how long you've been on the platform, how many orders you've rejected to do, how many weekends you've worked, how many evenings you've worked. And these metrics are then combined, and then only the workers who are rated the highest on the platform can get the best hours. And so this is kind of like an automation of this flexible discipline, this kind of algorithmic flexible discipline, that if you don't work hard enough, you don't work in the way the platform wants, then you won't get the hours, you won't be able to access the best hours. But then kind of what I ended that talk with was then this question of what enables this exploitation to be obscured, to enable this misrecognition, is that it's kind of embedded within relations. And Ashley Mears, an American sociologist, has this excellent article looking at gifts and how they enable control to be created relationally through, and in this case, in these retail examples, relationally, rather than just getting a print off of your schedule, the fact that you have to go and speak with your manager and discuss it, and they can help you, that relation then creates this misrecognition. And so if this then becomes automated through technology, then that raises the question of how does then misrecognition kind of take place in the workplace? And I think that's like an area for future research, is how does increased kind of detailed technological controls, how do they impact on kind of normative control in the workplace? How is consent produced in those workplaces?
Yes. Okay. So maybe thanks very much for your very comprehensive answer. And so just one final question, or maybe even comments from me, is that when you started the presentation, you talk about workplace relationship as a power relationship, and that that argument runs very much, or underpins very much your presentation, and I think your book as well. And indeed, conflict control has been, have been two key concepts running through the labor process debate. However, there is also another kind of discourse that emphasizing or calling for more emphasis on coordination and consent and collaboration, moving towards a more social partnership approach. In your presentation, you presented two cases, one of it UK partnership UK is, and the US is conflict US. So I could see that you already kind of signpost that there is some a level of cooperation in this partnership approach, and some role from the trade union. And picking up on the question that anonymous audience was saying early on, to say that in Australia there is, although there is a higher level of casualization, in fact, the workplace relationship is is more positive, luckily. So that brings my question, or maybe this is a rhetorical question, whether we should see workplace relationship not just as a power relationship at the workplace, but more so as a social relationship with social contract impacting on the greater society. So that's very much of the Peter Acker's 2006 in IJHRM paper about the neo-pluralism of the industrial relations, and calling for a wider, broader approach to look at the industrial relations at the workplace level. So I was wondering whether you see that there is scope to move to look at the glass as half full rather than half empty, or to see it as more kind of cooperative rather than continue to be the conflict zone. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so in the book, I spend a lot of time discussing partnership and so scheduling is meant to be a two-way process. It's meant to work for both workers and employers. There's this collective agreement, there's a trade union, but what kind of the partnership agreement also effectively does, and it does provide some protections from workers against kind of arbitrary discipline in terms of job threats, but it also mobilizes bias. So it's very hard. You're not allowed to raise collective grievances. Yeah. You can only raise individual grievances. There is a delegate system to these committees to discuss issues, which really detaches any workplace issues from kind of the rank and file of the workers. And it really, as one kind of trade union official, somebody who works for the trade union, said, it's just kind of enables partnership to kind of push down these policies, and the trade union reps in the workplace, they then just see their job as enforcing those policies, not collectively questioning or organizing against those policies. So I don't really, I don't think there is much of a social contract there. I think it's much more about this, power, and then how is power misrecognized by the parties involved in it. And kind of also then in Conflict Co is very interesting, because because they don't use a trade union, but instead they try and use kind of direct normative control. So they make workers do a cheer at the start of every shift, where they have to go, give me a C, give me an O, give me an F, and spell out conflict co, and then cheer, we're number one. They call the workers associates. They call disciplinaries coachings. They call all of these things. It's Orwellian use of language, but it's very ineffective because there's no kind of, it just highlights the difference between workers who are meant to be treated as associates, as members of this family, but actually being paid very poorly and facing this kind of flexible discipline. And so, yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah, sorry. Did you want to say more?
No, I was just going to say, so I think I'd see it kind of much more in terms of kind of the way that Bourdieu talks about power.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we are running out of time, and in fact we have run into overtime, and my fault for asking the question in a too long roundabout manner. And I would just like to thank everyone for on behalf of the Center for Global Business. Thanks first of all, Alex, for giving a wonderful presentation and for very comprehensive answers to all the questions. I would like to thank over 140 or 150 participants online listening to this seminar. I would also like to thank my excellent colleagues, Greg and also Marjorie, for co-chairing this session. And also thank Shahab behind the scene for organizing the whole seminar and providing all the technical support and logistic support we need. And the video of this seminar today will be made available as of tomorrow, so feel free to listen to it. Or and then also our next Center for Global Business seminar, a webinar, will be held on the 31st of July by Associate Professor Koya Kiazat. And so I look forward to seeing more of you in the future on the webinar. And so on behalf of the organizing team and on behalf of Monash University, I wish you all well. And for those who are in the Northern Hemisphere, just waking up in the morning, have a nice day. For those in the Southern Hemisphere in Australia, have a nice evening. Thank you.
Oh, Xie, thank you very much, Fang and everyone. And there is if anyone's interested in getting the book, there's details of a special discount offer for 30% discount for the book, and the details are in the chat function that you may have seen with the website to go to. So thanks everyone, and cheers, and we'll see you next time. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now.